we actually haven't had a chance to have any conversation whatsoever, so this is going to be very spontaneous. And I want to basically begin by saying, in terms of storytelling and narrative, a couple of weeks ago, I got a job at the New School in New York City, New School University, as a professor of innovation and design. And so I sent it out to a whole bunch of people, sort of announcing it. And to the people that I work with at Business Week, of course, Rena Jana and others, we talked, and it was wonderful and sweet and sad and great and all the rest of it. And for everyone else, I got a flood of emails. From David, I got a phone call. In fact, it was the only phone call that I did get that congratulated me. And it was hugely powerful, a simple phone call from someone saying, wonderful, it's great, you're on your voyage, another leg of the journey. And it reminded me, it was a wonderful experience for me in terms of congratulation and all of that. And it just epitomized how I think about you in terms of your work, which is built around experience, as opposed to basically around edifice. And I'm just going to do 30 seconds more to contrast you with, and I think David is one of the greatest architects of our time. And I think even the term architect doesn't quite do it. New York has a lot of new buildings these days, and that's a good thing. One of them is a New York Times building by Renzo Piano. And I went to a presentation recently about how wonderful the building is. And, it's sustainable, it's gorgeous, it's got great Tuscan colors. And as someone from his shop was describing it, it also has window shades that go up and down. And he was saying that, New York has wonderful sunsets. And so they decided automatically that, they decided that at every sunset, automatically the shades would come up so that everyone in the building would be able to see the beautiful sunset. I'm a journalist, and I was thinking to myself, gee, sunset, that happens around, 4:30, 5. That's basically deadline time. It's the last thing in the world the journalist wants is the sun in his eyes or her eyes. I sort of asked a couple of questions about, well, when you were designing this thing, who'd you talk to? Well, we talked to the Sulzberger family, and we talked to the city, and we talked to these folks. Turns out they hadn't talked to the people who actually produce anything in the building, the people who are the heart and soul of the building, which are the journalists. And in fact, they created an environment and experience which was terrible for the people who inhabit the building. They didn't quite get it, and they still don't quite get it. And he's about to do the same thing, I think, up in Columbia. So David is the opposite. He begins with the experience of the people living in the building, in the edifice, in the space, and whether it's within a restaurant or a children's hospital or whatever, that's what he's all about, for me. So with that kind of introduction, what are you doing these days?
Well, the New York Times story is a great story because I got a tour of the building, mostly from the House and Home, the design journalists, and they were very proud of the stair. There's a big newsroom, and it's a magnificent building. It is a beautiful structure. And I went through the House and Home section, and all of the editors were, to say slightly cranky about their space is understating it. And I said, well, you guys write about House and Home. Why don't you all take a crack at redoing this based on how you think it should be? And the look on their faces with the idea that they could cross that line from commenting on design to modifying their design. And I suppose that's what interests me the most at the moment is those blurring of lines. And I loved the last presentation. It was just unbelievable, particularly because I'm thinking right now on a project I can't talk about specifically, but it's a new cultural project in the city. And there was an RFP on it. And we started to think about culture, particularly in this economy, and sustainability has all kinds of meanings now, including how it's economically sustained. And thinking about the city and what it might need, and thinking about schools. And so very much on my mind is, I've always been interested in storytelling, as you know, and I've always felt like the key to a successful project was being right on the edge between terror and sort of thrill. And thinking that you don't know the answer is such a great motivator for me. And as my business has grown, it takes more. The energy to build something is very different than the energy to maintain. And I find the energy to maintain very uncreative. So I try to rip things apart and start over. And it's about a 5-year lag, I think, from the time I'm interested in something and our firm starts researching it until there's any bearing of it in the market. So when you ask what I'm focused on things, I'm focused on our lab right now. We have Tucker B. Meister.
Oh, right. What is this about?
It is about two things. It's about the belief that you have to precede the opportunity with research and development. You don't get an opportunity and then automatically have the ideas. And I've always been interested in materiality and craft. Yeah. And in fact, the next book I'm working on after Spectacle is about craft in a kind of unexpected way. But they are linked in that I think the obsession is in a world in which we have information about everyone around the world virtually, and there's such incredible virtual connections. Why do people still need to come together? What do we learn about each other being together? And of course, I'm very interested in theater, so even the form of the space we're in and being able, audience members to be able to see other audience members. So we push materiality. Yeah. And we figured the best way to do that, because trying to get a project manager who has a deadline in 6 months to embrace R&D is very hard. They're going to take the path of least resistance. So I had to embrace innovation and put it at the corner. When we renovated our office, I took a 2-story, 3,000 square foot space at the center of it and said, this area is not a profit center. This is a lab, and every project needs to come through here. And it's grown to be about craftsmanship, but also technology through some of the work we're doing in interactivity. And I think that that focus on craftsmanship is very near and dear to my heart. The other project I'm working on that ties into the last talk is I'm designing a play right now for George Wolfe, who I think is one of the most incredible directors. He directed Angels in America, and it's a world premiere of a John Guare play called Free Man of Color. And when I first read the play, I called George and I said, it's great, I don't know what the fuck it's about, but it's brilliant.
Watch your mouth.
You're one to talk about the potty mouth. And he said, I don't know either, but we're going to discover it together. And I thought, how amazing is that? And so it's a play that is about 1801 New Orleans and this uncharted territory in America, the Louisiana Purchase, and the sort of battle between the Spanish and the French. And it's a sort of surreal restoration comedy that ends as a devastating tragedy that looks at kind of the destruction of that European perfection and what happens. And what made me think about it is John Guare, as he wrote the play, as writers can do, was very prescriptive. And he had the set rumbling and crumbling. And of course, as a designer, I'd love to create a rumbling set. That would be great. So as George and I worked on it, I presented it to John for the first time yesterday. It opens in January, but the director hadn't shown it to the writer. And he cried. He was so moved by the fact that I embraced his story. As a designer, you find other people's stories to embrace. You find ways to integrate. And for in terms of innovation, it's finding those threads and those stories. And of course, the set doesn't rumble or crumble, because that would have been about the design, and it wouldn't have been about the story. It would have given the audience a great chance to go, well, God, that's a cool rumbling set. Which is what I think a lot of people think design is sort of pyrotechnics,
Yeah.
as opposed to finding that central core DNA and then using all of the research you've done before that to solve that problem.
It's fascinating, fascinating. Got to get tickets to this early, huh?
It's going to be a major sellout. It's at the Public Theater, late January, and there's only 200 seats, and Jeffrey Wright is in it, who's amazing.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm on the board of the Public, and when the Public said you need to sign a conflict of interest if you're going to be designing for the Public, I pointed out how much money I was going to lose doing it, and I thought the conflict of interest was unnecessary. But
Did they agree?
Once I pointed that out, they were fine with that.
They're very good. Okay. Yesterday we had a small conversation with Richard Saul Wurman.
Is he still here?
No. Which was in itself remarkable, having a small conversation with Richard Saul Wurman. One of the things, he's not here. One of the things that we did talk about was how interesting it is that people in an era of virtual connectedness still felt the need to be connected physically in the same space. And I tried to pull out of him, he was talking about TED and TED Talks and all those wonderful talks you can now see on your computer, and yet sales for the conference are still Zooming. People still want to go to the conference. And there is something about the need to, but I couldn't pull it out of him. He couldn't really abstract it. And maybe you can do it. Why do people come together for spectacles? Why do they want to still physically be together if they can do all these things virtually?
Well, the book Spectacle grew out of an invitation from Phaidon, the publisher, for me to do a book on theater history. And Richard, if he was here, would claim that he's the reason that I've made it in the theater. And it's not entirely untrue. And I'll tell you why. When I first spoke at TED, I'd gone to TED, and when I first spoke there, the ground rule, which some people don't pay attention to it, but the suggestion is you talk about something other than what you do for a living. You try and find something passionate, something that in the best sense you're an amateur at. And I was brought up, my mom was a dancer in vaudeville, and my dad died when I was very young. My mom remarried. We moved as a troupe, 5 brothers. And I always had this interest in theater, and then we moved to Mexico, and my interest in theater became interest in public theater. And what I became fascinated with in Mexico that, now retroactively I can look back and say made sense. Of course, when you're doing it, you don't understand that path, is there's this amazing sense of ritual that we live with that connects our daily lives. The things we do, the people we connect with. In Mexico, where I lived on the shore of New Jersey, there was no real public realm. And in Mexico, everything took place in the marketplace, the kind of filtered light, the bull ring, these connected spaces that made up Guadalajara in my mind, and the kind of myth of public space. So when Richard asked me to speak, I put together a talk on the relationship of theater and architecture, taking 5 elements from theater that make it so vital in looking how it applies to architecture. One example is transformation. That, in theater, first of all, you're only there for the memory, right? So nothing there lasts. And George Wolfe was reminiscing about that yesterday, that 100 people commit their lives for 3 months, and then this thing is up for 2 months and it's gone. So you're not doing it for the permanence, you're doing it for the experience and the inverse relationship between memory and permanence. So I began this journey thinking about the relationship of theater and architecture. And about 10 years ago, Jules Fisher, who's the genius Broadway lighting designer, I think he's won 14 Tonys, he's just an incredible human being, said to me, we were seeing some production and I was critiquing the set, and he said, well, why don't you do it? Why don't you do it? And I said, well, I'm busy, I don't know how I'd go about it. And he said, just start to meet with directors. As I started to meet with directors, socially, all of them talked about transitions, which is the opposite of what architects think about theater. They think it's a backdrop, and it's really more about storytelling and how you get from one place to the other, and how the physical world gets you from one place to the other. Richard asked me to speak again, and I took the research I had done and looked at the building form of theater, starting with the smallest group, say the mummers, when it's just a storytelling, and looked at how financial needs, religion, technology, storytelling all modified the form of how theater happened. So when I started to look at this for Phaidon as a theater history book, I just thought, God, there's so many great theater history books out there. And I had just come back from the Balloon Festival in Albuquerque, and I started to think about the idea of temporal communities. And as I started to research theater outside the bounds of walls, and interviewed 20 amazing people, and Bruce Mao helped us design the book. And one of the things I realized in terms of why people need this is, architecture, cities, New York from the air looks very neat grid. And you get down on the ground, it's messy, it's vital, people don't agree. Not as vital as it used to be, but I think public space is at risk at the moment in our cities, and how do we create public space that allows spectacle and allows the public to congregate, which is something for security reasons cities are leery of.
Oh, that's what you're getting at, I see.
So I think the reason people come together is they're looking for a mission bigger than themselves. Mm-hmm. I think they're looking for some connection to sort of humanity. I think storytelling is kind of the oldest form of communication. And I think we want to rub up against people and have that visceral experience that paradoxically I think is more in demand. I see more festivals happening. I actually see that accelerating.
More festivals.
Yeah.
So there's more people feeling more of a need perhaps to be connected in this way. One of the things that I've noticed with storytelling and storytellers is that the very best storytellers are also the best story listeners. And that for the process to be truly powerful, the storyteller has to first listen to or understand the audience, the culture, and have the story that is being told relate in an intimate way and connect with the audience. And I think that's one of the things that you do really well. Storytelling as a medium now is very much in vogue. You hear it all over Madison Avenue, and you hear it all over corporate America. It's become the thing. But I've also noticed that, and maybe it's because we come out of New York City where outputting is sort of the cultural norm, the storytellers are telling you the story, regardless of whether you want to hear it or it relates to you. But it's clearly not something you do. You are a really wonderful listener. So,
well, I think that what I found early on, my career started 25 years ago with restaurants. And it was a fluke, but I was asked to do a Japanese restaurant on 46th Street. And I was still working for a firm, and I did it in the evenings. And it was an insane, just miserable guy, the chef, and he's still around. I won't name his name, but he cooks at Sushi Zen if you want to look him up. He ran out of money. He didn't have the money, and I designed and made this 100-foot-long silk mural out of about 20 different colored hand-dyed silks, and I brought in this woman from the Santa Fe Opera Festival to help me make it, and they didn't have the money to light it. And it was like life-threatening to me. This was what So I borrowed the money from a friend of mine to lend them to pay for the neon for the project they couldn't pay me for. And the restaurant won all these awards. It won a lighting award, the Guth Award, and I didn't have any particular interest in restaurants. But what I was interested in, the things I was interested in then are still the things I'm interested in terms of storytelling.
Yeah.
And that's understanding from this chef where he came from, what he was interested in. He was interested in communicating with people at the sushi bar, for instance. And the thing he was most insistent on is mocking up the height between the customer who's seated and the eye line of the sushi chef. Mm-hmm. Now, I found that fascinating. That was about that communication. So we took the sushi bar and I made it lightning bolt shaped, so there were as many places for congregating as possible. So it's taking a form that essentially is a one-on-one form and making it more social.
So instead of a straight line of chairs, it was zigzag.
Yeah,
you could have
and
more
you could have
people.
groups of 4. And so the leap from restaurants to other things, particularly narrative things, was natural for me because I always found extracting, and chefs never think they have anything to say. They really do. They're largely not verbal about how they differentiate what they want to do. Mm-hmm. But yet, if you talk to them, when we started working for Nobu, he still doesn't like that I tell this story, but I had his food, and he talked about his background from as a master sushi chef and then being in South America and trying Peruvian chili paste, which is a street food. He doesn't like the street food analogy. But it is true that his genius, among many things, was combining those dissimilar tastes and his idea of complex taste with simple presentations. And that was really the thing we drew out. It's harder culturally to get clients to understand that they matter, I find. Particularly if they want to go from inception to success. And so listening is critical, and not only listening, but prompting. What
Prompting.
if? Oh, pulling out.
Actively pulling.
Yeah.
And knowing how to do that. That must be an art, to be able to prompt to get the information. That's really interesting. Just making a little bit of connection here in terms of schools and moving into expanding civic society outside the theater and restaurants and all the rest of it. I remember being hugely bored, my time is up, hugely bored in school and being a terrible student. Probably worse than you, Melvin. But the idea of listening to students and trying to find out, how they wanted to relate to teachers and their education.
Well, since time is up, one last idea I want to throw out there because it's something that I'm passionate about. Is our latest mission is reinventing playgrounds.
That's right.
And it started after 9/11 when I was asked by the city to create a VIP viewing platform at Ground Zero, and I went down there with friends. This is 2 weeks after 9/11, and I said, I think that's a really terrible idea. The viewing platform you have, which was a simple platform, was fine. But I would create a public viewing platform and raise the money privately, which we did in 100 days. And this foundation existed, and several people who'd given me money to the foundation wanted to continue, and they said, what do you want to do next? So I had this idea of an arts center downtown that was both a school and a performance space. And it was the most miserable year of my life, trying to get LMDC and the city to agree on anything. And it was so politicized, and I spent all this money and time, and finally a lobbyist said, you're never going to get people to agree on anything. I mean, people on the LMDC board didn't know who Arthur Miller was. So this was a real... So in a moment...
Lower Manhattan board.
Lower Manhattan. Yeah. So in a moment of frustration, someone who works with me said, well, I said to them, I should have just given the money and designed a playground for our kids because their playground had been destroyed.
Yeah.
And he said to me, what would that be like? And it began 2 years of listening and looking at how kids form their ability to communicate and create communities and build and be creative, and kind of recognizing that all of that had been beaten out of playgrounds by insurance and sameness and
exactly.
So that's, and it's called imaginationplayground.org if you want to look at it. The first one's opening in a year in Lower Manhattan, although we have a temporary version called Imagination Playground in a Box that Kaboom is partnered with us to build 500 of them this year, and it's all about kids making their own space.
Where is that going to be in New York?
The permanent one is going to be at Burling Slip, which is just south of the South Street Seaport.
Oh, fantastic. David, thank you. This is great.